Okay, great. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I just wanted to say welcome to everyone to our panel, Future Proofing Our Curriculum. I'm going to be introducing each panelist just before they speak. As they are speaking, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A and we will address those at the end. We did get a few off the app earlier as well. So our first speaker is going to be Therese Jones, and she is the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, she represents over 50 satellite companies on regulatory, legislative, cybersecurity, space safety, defense, remote sensing, and export control issues. In her spare time, she is a co-founder of the Z Factor Fellowship, founder of the AIAA Diversity Scholarship, founding partner of spaceinterns.org, and she's on the board of the Students for Exploration and Development of Space. So she is going to be talking about the role of the commercial sector in U.S. governmental space activities. So, Therese, I will hand it to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. Let me share my screen and put this in presentation mode. So I'm just going to be giving a brief overview. Okay, it was working. Sorry about that. Of U.S. governmental space policy from an outside perspective. So there's a very complex web of relationships across the federal government. I'll talk about each one of these organizations that's on the screen. These are a subset of the organizations involved in space, but the ones that I have worked with most closely. So going to the Executive Office of the President, the Executive Office of the President has quite a few different roles related to space. There's the Office of Science and Technology Policy that sort of thinks about, big picture roadmaps for the future of science and technology in the US. There's the Office of Management and Budget, which sets the president's budget for different executive branch agencies. There's the US Trade Representative, which is important since space is such an international endeavor. There's a National Security Council, and you can imagine that with all of the defense applications for space, the National Security Council has been very involved in space issues. And excitingly, the Biden administration has decided to continue the National Space Council, which was revived under the last administration after a very long hiatus since Bush the first. And we don't know the composition this administration yet. It might be slightly different in the past administration, but it's chaired by the vice president and it has members who are largely cabinet officials or heads of the agencies listed there. So quite a few different actors that are coming together to talk about space issues. There's also a National Space Council Users Advisory Group, and that's an opportunity for not just the commercial sector, but also academia and other stakeholders with interest in the space industry to advise the Space Council on their broad needs. So the deadline is coming up. It's October 29th for applications. I've been assured that this administration will be very diverse, both in terms of demographics and disciplines. So I encourage you to apply. And the Space Council, under the last administration, came up with a number of space policy directives that were sort of setting the stage for space policy that was being done by the executive branch agencies. It covered everything from getting to the moon and Mars to space traffic management, cybersecurity issues. And even though there's a change in administration and change in the executive secretary and composition of the National Space Council, I think a lot of these efforts are probably going to continue. Then we've got Congress and the legislative branch agencies. So Congress funds all executive branch agencies. Right now, they're working on the National Defense Authorization Act, and there are different space provisions in there. They're also working on budget reconciliation and talking about how to fund broadband, potentially including satellite broadband across the US, and making sure everyone has internet connectivity. Another big issue is space situational awareness and space traffic management. And they've been talking about where space traffic management should fall in the federal government and space situational awareness. It's traditionally been an activity that's fallen under DoD, but now that there are so many commercial actors in space, there's discussion of it going to the Office of Space Commerce in the Department of Commerce, but the Congress has not yet authorized SSA to fall there, even though they've given it a little bit of funding. Congress can also call for the evaluation of different programs in these executive branch agencies, and they can change the mandate of the executive branch agencies as well. There's also a Congressional Budget Office that does, evaluations of different programs and how much budget they need, as well as the Government Accountability Office, which does program evaluation at the request of Congress. Then I'm sure you all know NASA. I won't talk about NASA too much since I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but they are heavily shifting toward commercial partnerships. They do provide, some funding mechanisms for companies and do basic scientific research. But one thing to keep in mind is that they do not regulate. NASA, unlike some international countries, does not have any role in regulation of the commercial space industry, but they can provide analysis that aids regulatory agencies. And that's come up a lot in talking about space situational awareness and space traffic management. NASA is considered the expert agency on orbital debris and has done things like advise the FCC on orbital debris issues. Then we've got DoD, and DoD is a huge user of space. So you've got all your different military branches, including now Space Force, and all of them are heavy users of space since they use it for communications, especially in remote areas, and use it for imagery and remote sensing data, and of course, GPS as well. There are, in addition to the military branches, there are the combatant commands, there are regional commands. So the military branches coordinate regionally within those. There are also functional combatant commands on cyber, space, special operations, strategic, and transportation. So obviously space and cyber are very important to the space industry. In addition to the military, there are 17 total different intelligence agencies, and then a number that space is important to, including CIA, NSA, which does a lot of the cybersecurity end, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency doing a lot of remote sensing work, National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Intelligence Agency, and then there are intelligence agencies for the military branches as well. And then the Office of the Secretary of Defense, sort of sets DoD space policy. And right now you've probably all heard a lot about Space Force. There's also a Space Development Agency that's working on a lot of commercial space issues. I already mentioned space traffic management and how they're sort of trying to shift over to only government function and give the commercial side over to the Office of Space Commerce. They're really trying to diversify their space architecture and move from the model where they used to build very exquisite satellites on their own to a model where they really rely on commercial industry for both constellations of satellites that are proliferated, so you can't just attack one asset and lose a lot of capabilities, but also buying services rather than entire satellites. So interacting quite a lot with them as well. Then there's the Department of Homeland Security. They coordinate closely with DoD. They use space assets in some of their missions, like monitoring smuggling, illegal fishing, and they also have missions in the Arctic and Antarctic. They also are very focused on the defense of US assets against attacks, particularly cyber attacks. And with Space Policy Directive 5 on cybersecurity, they have really started looking at space cybersecurity as an important area of focus. They have a new space systems working group and are talking about industry best practices. And they are also in charge of a number of critical infrastructure functions for the US government, including communications. So satellite communications is a very important part of DHS's work. Then we've got the State Department. So you might not think that Department of State actually engages much with commercial industry, but they do, because they represent not just the US government, but they are responsible for making sure that their citizens and companies that their citizens represent are in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. And so they work very closely with the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and bring industry into discussions on things that are important, like long-term sustainability and the issues on satellites and astronomy. I was actually on the COPUOS delegation a couple of weeks ago talking about satellites and astronomy. And also, just bringing commercial space services to new space actors. They are involved with that as well. They also, talk to the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and the International Telecommunications Union, which does all of the spectrum issues internationally, as well as the Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. So we've sort of engaged with them on all of those fronts in terms of industry. Then we've got the FAA. Their Office of Commercial Space Transportation covers launch and reentry. They also are responsible for payload authorization. So at any time a launch happens, they have to sign off on whatever is being launched. So there are some satellites that aren't covered by the other agencies, such as radio frequency satellites. So I know Hawkeye 360, when they get a license, they are not covered under a remote sensing license because they're radio frequency, but they do have to go through this payload authorization. Unlike the rest of the FAA, they have both a promotional and regulatory mandate. So they are out there trying to promote the commercial space industry, including commercial human spaceflight launches. And right now there's a moratorium set by Congress on commercial human spaceflight safety regulations until 2023. So they are in charge of safety of people on the ground and making sure that you aren't launching rockets over large populations and potentially endangering them if something goes wrong. But there's no regulations for people who are actually on the spacecraft at this point. Then we got the FCC, work with them a lot. They're an independent agency and they regulate all non-governmental spectrum use. NTIA, which is in commerce, covers the government side of spectrum use. Everything that communicates in space with the ground needs FCC authorization to launch if they're US based, or if you want market access to the US. If you're a communication satellite, your remote sensing satellite, and you're downlinking your data to the US, you also need to get authorization through them. And then they file this information with the International Telecommunications Union. The International Bureau is the primary portion of the FCC that works on satellites. But there's spillover into other agencies depending on the issues, because as you can imagine, they have to coordinate with spectrum use with terrestrial users as well. And they're talking a lot about 5G and repurposing spectrum for 5G uses. There's also an open orbital debris rulemaking where they're talking about things like, do satellites need propulsion? Should they be required to indemnify in the event of a collision? And they have suggested that operators should post a bond requirement as well to ensure that their satellites are successfully deorbited. So those are a couple of the issues that they're working on. And I just put this up here. They're not meant to read it. It's just to show the spectrum allocation table is very, very complicated. So lots of time spent working on this at the FCC. And then the final agency I wanted to talk about was Department of Commerce. They've got a promotional mandate, which has been great for the space industry. They've got an Office of Space Commerce, which covers a lot of issues for the industry. I mentioned the space situational awareness issue before. They also, are trying to help new space companies grow. They're under NOAA right now, and they worked on commercial remote sensing regulatory reform with NOAA. There's also in commerce, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. I mentioned they do government spectrum licensing. Bureau of Industry and Security that does work on export control issues, which are a big issue in the space industry, since there are so many dual use technologies. There's a Bureau of Economic Analysis that has done some work on the size of the space economy. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology, which is working a lot on cybersecurity issues in the space industry now and coming up with best practices. And also the International Trade Administration, which works on space trade issues at some level. So broad overview of these major agencies. How do you make changes if you're an outsider? For the regulatory agencies, anytime they want to make new regulations, they have to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking. Anyone can submit a response to that. For instance, the United Church of Christ submitted comments to the orbital debris notice of proposed rulemaking at the FCC because they see it as a broader part of their environmentalism to keep space clean. So you can file your own comments. There's also, I mentioned the users advisory group and just meetings with the stakeholders and executive branch agencies is the way to generally have productive dialogues. For Congress, they often ask industry for input prior to introducing legislation. Also recommend meeting with staff on relevant committees to space. or whatever space technology you're using. It's also very helpful if you can tie it into their district. They love hearing from students, by the way, if you're a student, and hearing about what you're doing if you're in their district. And I will note, with great lobbying power come surprise things in bills. Like a few years ago, there was an earmark for millions for a university space situational awareness research center. And based on the committee, I know exactly which researcher got that put in the bill. So helpful if you're tied into their district. And then you want to make changes in DoD. Change is often very slow and requires congressionally mandated studies for a lot of things, but they are trying to become a lot more agile through investing in organizations like the Defense Intelligence Unit, Space Development Agency, and working on new technologies in DARPA. And with that, I know it was a lot very quickly. I have a link here and I can drop it, I think, in the chat as well. This is a guide to getting into the space industry, or if you're a student or young professional. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions. So stop sharing and answer questions later. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, next we are going to have Dr. Gary Deal. And he has an incredibly diverse background. His expertise includes business, hospitality, law, higher education, consulting, and of course, space operations. Gary earned a master's degree in space studies from the American Public University System. And he currently teaches undergraduate space and astronomy classes for APUS as well. He has published nearly 100 articles and podcasts related to space concepts and ideas. Recently, he presented on proposals for Venus colonization at the Mensa World Gathering event in Houston, Texas. And Gary's talk is entitled "Private Sector Visionaries Are the Way Forward." So I will turn it over to you, Gary.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen as well. Can you see that?
Looks good to me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the warm introduction, and nice to see everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be here again. As Michelle said, I'm Gary, and happy to talk to the group today about private sector visionaries and why I think our money is probably better placed on these. I only have one slide, so I'll be an interesting contrast to Therese, who came with much more information and made me feel a little intimidated now. But we didn't coordinate or communicate in any way on this, but I do think that the difference between our presentations will conveniently get right to the point of my talk here. So I want to say I don't have a horse in this race. I'm not being funded or sponsored by corporate interests in the space exploration or space tourism, space mining sectors. I'm just looking at the problem from a realistic perspective, and I have an opinion on this issue that I think is worth considering and promoting when it comes to the industry and education, for the sake of again, putting our chips where they're going to do the most good. And I should note at the onset that this is not necessarily a consensus opinion. This is an opinion related to, again, my own research, but there are other experts in the industry who disagree with me on this. And one noteworthy, for example, is Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's been very public about his support for the idea that if we're interested in robust exploration, unprecedented pioneering, we're probably best putting our money on national space agencies. And I understand why he's coming from that perspective, but I want to try to scrutinize that argument a little bit over the next maybe 10 minutes or so, just to talk about some of the reasons why I think times have changed enough that we're unlikely to see that happen in the way that may have happened in a previous generation. So on this slide, I put together just a very short list of some of the reasons why I think the private sector is better positioned and probably more likely to make leaps in space exploration and to do some of the firsts that we've ever seen in the decades to come. The first category or list here are some of the reasons why I think specifically the public sector is sort of fighting with one arm tied behind its back. It's got a difficult road to hoe here. And some of these reasons include term limits and election cycles, and the fact that with each new administration, there's a desire to put one's name and sort of legacy behind what it is we're doing at NASA and the other 97 departments that Therese very kindly illustrated in her talk. Thank you for that. And so but the point is every 4 or at best 8 years, our administrative policies shift, sometimes in monumental ways and sometimes in subtle ways. But the problem with that, of course, is that the timeline for major space initiatives, efforts, and philosophies and guiding missions behind programs like NASA are far longer, typically, than the 4 to 8 year windows that accompany presidential administrations. And so even if party affiliations don't change, there are new candidates who come in with new ideas. And the last major space policy that we saw really came in the form of the Bush administration's policies and the Constellation Project. And then we had, of course, Obama, who scratched a lot of that in light of the economic troubles of the late 2000s and the early 2010s. Now we're in a different era, but it's also considered, it's important to think about the fact that this is, in some ways, it's a silver lining that perhaps space policy is one of the last bastions of federal activity that hasn't been so overly politicized that we're completely polarized as a society over it. You ask the average Democrat or Republican about how they feel over what NASA is doing, you're not going to get a lot of disagreements and opinion on that because we just haven't found our way to tribalism yet. So I'm a little bit skeptical that we'll stay that way, but that's the way it is at present. You don't have major disagreements over what we're doing. You may have some disagreements about how much money we're spending across basically conservative versus progressive ideological lines, but you don't have major disagreement there. But if you go back and you look at the last few presidential elections and you try to even put your finger on what the major space policy precedents were for the candidates, they're a footnote, right? They come after things like health policies and public health and health insurance. And I'm even talking pre-COVID, and foreign affairs, right? And where we should militarize or nation build and who we should be friends with versus foes. And how do we handle the economy? How much should we pay in taxes? And, on the 47th line item down the list, somewhere in there, we find, oh yeah, well, we should also do something with NASA at some point. So it's not necessarily a priority in the public sphere in the way that it was under, say, for example, the Kennedy administration and his successors, obviously, that led NASA to the moon until we ended the space race, right, definitively. And we haven't really had a fervor or an emphasis behind it since then. The terrestrial problems that are competing for attention, again, things like the national health crises, the tax debates, and so on and so forth. Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, a personal hero of mine, famously said, are these problems that we should solve first, or are they a reason for going, as in, to space and into space exploration? So these are big questions, but of course, a lot of the public doesn't spend as much time nearly as we space enthusiasts spend thinking about this, what we're doing with it. Financial waste that accompanies the public sector space operations, right? So particularly cost plus contract modeling, and the fact that this has been criticized from many different angles by a lot of different people, but there's a lot of waste that comes behind that, and almost incentives to inflate the bottom lines. So then half a penny on a tax dollar that NASA was getting in the first place, which I think most of us as people who appreciate what we're doing in space would agree is far too little. Is going to much less than it could be if it was spent in a more efficient way. And that general inefficiency from bureaucracy, again, the companies, the bureaucracy, the federal government, and I'm not arguing that all bureaucracy is bad. There are a lot of good reasons for some of it. But I couldn't help but laugh when I didn't know, Therese, that the FCC had a moratorium on rules for passenger flights. And I couldn't help but think to myself, we have a regulation to stop regulations until subsequent regulations. So, and the spectrum chart for radio bandwidth almost gave me a seizure. So, some of these things are worth thinking about when we're considering which side of this scale is best poised to make progress in the near term. Again, I'm not arguing for organization or unity or some level of order to the process, but as we all know, if you've ever worked for the government or with the government, it can get overkill really quickly. So shifting here with my remaining few minutes to the private sector sort of pros as opposed to the public sector cons, because I'm not trying to spend all of my time just dumping on the government. But for the private sector, you have a market competition to drive innovation, and we haven't really seen that in a material way on the public sector since the space race. Right, there was major competition there to not die, right, and to not hold the low ground and to maintain the advantage in space. Which is what pushed us in our drive against the Soviets to be the first into space, which we ultimately were not, but the first to the moon and to do some of the many other things that we can claim first too. Since that time, we still compete when it comes to things like surveillance technology and the ability to use space for monitoring and peacekeeping. But we also have international treaties that forbid the use of space for militaristic purposes or weaponizing. So a lot of that has fallen into sort of dormancy. It's not to say we don't use it and we don't compete. We certainly do, but not in the way that we do in capitalist consumer markets. And what I mean by that is, for example, things like space tourism, which are now being heavily pursued. They have been for years, but they're now finally coming to fruition with the first flights of the Virgin Galactic Enterprise and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin and the Innovation 4 flight that recently returned. We're seeing the burgeoning steps taking place in space tourism. And as a tourism expert myself and coming from that world in a previous life, that's exciting to me. And I think that holds a lot of material value for our consumer markets. Space mining, right? Some of the other space initiatives that come around exploration of the immediate solar system around us. Again, Michelle mentioned the talk that I recently gave about, it was a comparing and contrasting of the different value and advantages and disadvantages of pursuing Venus versus Mars for colonization. Where should we go and why? And there are exciting reasons to look at both. Less red tape around decisions and milestones. I'm tempted to say none, but of course, anybody who's worked in a heavily corporatized world knows that there's still red tape. But within the boundaries of things like federal rules, FAA, you're still beholden to restrictions from the government on what you can do. You're not beholden to all the steps that are followed that can be so tedious that they almost halt progress altogether. So, if you've ever watched C-SPAN for 3 minutes, you know what this is like, constant rubber stamping and the red tape that goes with it. So we can move a lot of that out of the way with the private sector. More consistent long-term leadership and vision, right? So at least more consistent than the cycles of politicians in Washington and elsewhere. If you have an industry leader like SpaceX, for example, and Musk is there at the forefront and he has this passion behind what he wants to do for colonizing Mars and making space tourism and space exploration a reality, to the extent that he doesn't give up or die, he's going to be there and pursuing that constant vision and driving the company in that direction. And that allows for this long-term vision to become a reality because there's enough of a timeline to permit it. And last but not least, not as sensitive to public opinion. If you have an IPO and you're publicly held, then you have shareholders that you have to answer to. But a lot of the companies we're talking about at this point don't even have that. And so you're really just beholden to the ownership interests and the passions behind it. DeGrasse's main argument behind, the preference over public sector versus private sector was that private sector would never go anywhere without a profit motive, without a guaranteed return on investment to go to a place like Mars and know that we'll make our money back and we won't lose it all in risk. But I think we're seeing from visionaries like Branson and Musk and even Bezos that there's enough wealth within these companies and within these individuals, frankly, that they don't need to rely on that. They don't need to rely on the P&L turning black at the end of every single quarter to survive. And so now you're looking at people who just have a passion for this and don't care how much they bring to the bottom line for the shareholders or how much they put in the bank account at the end of the month. And I think that's really important to drive it. But I think that kind of nullifies the concern that private sector would never do it without a guaranteed profit motive. So with that being said, these are my thoughts on, again, private sector visionaries having the upper hand as probably the more likely case to bring space exploration firsts and pioneering in our own lifetime, and why I think it should be emphasized in our curriculum and in our efforts moving forward. And I look forward to questions at the end. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Gary. Okay. We're going to have Dr. Mark Kelso, and he is an adjunct faculty member here at APUS and also a practicing attorney. He lives in Savannah, Georgia. Mark is a retired Chief Warrant Officer 4 and a U.S. Army Master Aviator. He retired after 25 years of service, so thank you for that, Mark. He is currently in his last semester at the University of Mississippi School of Law, where he's pursuing an LLM in air and space law. So he's going to be talking about the legal and ethical issues of spaceflight participants, exploring the realm of space tourism in the United States. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Watts, for having me on the panel. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're going to talk basically about some spaceflight participants, and as we heard earlier, space tourism is really kind of ramping up here in the United States these days. This is my presentation agenda. A lot of stuff to cover. This is basically one over the world. We're going to cover a lot of things here. What started it? What is a spaceflight participant? Some of the actual laws govern spaceflight. Important issues like informed consent. And how do you become a commercial astronaut through the FAA? Here's how it started. Anzar X Prize. Back in 1927, Raymond Orte, very famous wealthy hotel owner, put out $25,000 to the first person who could fly nonstop from New York City to Paris. And obviously that was Charles Lindbergh. So which he did in May 20th, 1927. Based on that, the NC came up with the X Prize. They call it the New Spirit of St. Louis organization. And the reason was the creation of a new generation of launch vehicles designed to carry passengers into space. The initial X Prize required a team to privately build, launch, and finance a vehicle capable of carrying 3 passengers to approximately 62.5 miles and safely return to Earth. Not only that, you had to do it twice. You had to do it in 2 weeks. Spaceship One was the winner of the X Prize, which is solely funded by Paul Allen, Microsoft, designed by Burt Rutan, and built by his company Scale Composites. So October 4th, a second flight for him, 2004, he won the $10,000. It cost $30 million to do it. So he won 10 million, but 30. And interesting to note is Eric Lindbergh, which is Charles Lindbergh's grandson, was on the board of the inside. There's Spaceship One. It's pretty cool. So what is a spaceflight participant? This is per 14 CFR Part 401. A spaceflight participant means the individual is not crew and is carried aboard a launch vehicle or reentry vehicle. Right now, we have currently some of the major ones I think you've heard before: SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, Boeing. And I threw space perspective in there because that's something coming up here in about a couple of years, maybe. SpaceX, I know that to go to the International Space Station. They have the Crew Dragon modules. They have the Falcon 9 launch rockets. Recently, Inspiration 4, which was a commercial civilian flight, which I'm going to talk about here shortly, up in orbit. So that's Elon Musk, company there. Virgin Galactic, that's Sir Richard Branson. This is Spaceship Two, out of Spaceport America, New Mexico. This plane's max altitude about 68 miles. 8 passengers, which is 2 crew, and 6 passengers. I'm sorry, 8 people, 2 crew, 2 passengers. It was $250,000. Now it's $450,000 if you want to do it. He did launch his on July 11th, 2021, and his operation is currently grounded by the FAA due to airspace violations. So his aircraft are kind of violated protected airspace that the FAA set for him, but I'm sure they'll resolve that. This is a picture of his new Spaceship 3. It has not flown yet to my knowledge. Blue Origin. This is New Shepard. It's Jeff Bezos. He just took off in orbit, July 20th, 2021. This rocket's designed for 11-minute flight up to the Cayman line, 7 people, 62 miles. This is a vertical takeoff and landing rocket. If everybody watched it, that rocket landed perfectly. This is out of Texas. Okay, Boeing, this is the CST-100 Starliner. Coming out of Cape Canaveral. It's going to carry up to 7 people with room for 1 space tourist seat. Currently delayed due to propulsion system issues. This is space perspective. This is going to be happening here about 2024. Basically, they're going to be launching the big balloon and the gondola in it. So you're going to have a bar in it. You're going to have a bathroom. It's going to have Wi-Fi. They're calling it internet ready. It's a Neptune capsule. So you can be live streaming what you're doing, 100,000 feet. So you're not going into space, but you're going pretty high. You should be able to see a little bit of the curve of the Earth. Oh, some past space flight participants. This is Dennis Tito. This is 2001. He wanted to go to the International Space Center. He went through NASA. NASA would not train him. Space Adventures is the company that organizes these things, made it possible through Russia. And he got to go to the International Space Station about 8 days. He even did experiments. And he paid $20 million. And this is basically back in 2001. This is Yo Seon. This is from South Korea. Russia did train her 15 months. It cost about $26 million for her. This was back in 2008. And when she got on board this International Space Station, they didn't really know what to call her, so they called her a spaceflight participant. Okay, some recent flights we talked about: Virgin Galactic, Spaceship 2, VSS Unity, that was July 11th, Blue Origin, July 20th, 2021, and SpaceX Inspiration 4, low Earth orbit, just recently. So here's a picture of the Virgin Galactic crew. Got a picture of Blue Origin, I saw on TV. And Inspiration 4 crew members, and notice they're wearing spacesuits and helmets. The other guys were not wearing any kind of helmets or anything. I thought it was very, very interesting. Here's some basic laws that are going to be covered in the commercial space flight as it came in. 1984, President Reagan signed the Commercial Space Launch Act. Get some commercial actors involved. Going through the years, the Commercial Space Launch Act amendments came in 1988. 1998, you got President Bush coming in, saying basically at the time, NASA had to rely, or everybody had to rely on NASA to do something in space, but now it's just that for NASA needs to actually purchase things from commercial operations. This Commercial Launch Competitive Act of 2015. I continue with some space policy directives, SPT2, which actually streamlined regulations on commercial use. It's very important. Space Policy Directive 3 does the space situational awareness, kind of shifts the satellite operations from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce. I think Teresa talked about the AST, which is the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, various FARs, 14 CFR parts, and recently the new Part 450, which combined a lot of these parts. It streamlined the launch and reentry license requirement, and actually you can get a loan license here for 5 years. And there's the Commercial Space Flight Management, SPD3. Important. And of course, these are reusable launch vehicles. So actually different parts of the statute regulations cover these. So launch licenses under 415. Important to note is the financial responsibility under 440. 460 will listen to the extra requirements for crew, space flight participants. And there's basically the two subparts, part A and B. A deals with the launch and reentry with the crew as crew members, and part B does launch and reentry with the space flight participant. Okay, so looking at crew and space flight participant. The crew is talking about how to work the aircraft, the capsule. Space flight participants have to know basic emergency procedures if there's a fire. But each, on both parts, have to execute a reciprocal waiver of claim against the United States government, which we'll talk about quickly. We talk about informed consent. Just kind of goes in line with that. Right now, there is 12 licensed non-federal launch sites, commercial spaceports. I'm hoping soon to be 13 here, one where I live. Commercial spaceports can be either horizontal or vertical. They have to use FAA guidelines. Spaceport America, which is Virgin Galactic, is obviously a horizontal launch site. Think about the X-15, and Blue Origin is a vertical launch site, just like Kennedy or Cape Canaveral. So there's ethical and environmental issues here with this. It's a very inherently dangerous activity. And really almost a super rich can even become one. So if you look at 20 ups of millions of dollars to do it, commercial spacecraft are not certified by NASA or the FAA. There's black carbon emission issues, which definitely contribute to the global climate change. There's always the potential for Earth contamination, damage to property in the event of a catastrophic event. And it will shut down large portions of airspace during launch and reentry operations. We have the Space Data Integrator implemented to take care of that. And informed consent, really very important, because when you get on this thing, one of these, they have to tell you what's wrong with this, what happened to it, what we do to fix it. There are unknown hazards. This can result in your serious injury or death. And they have to, in writing, and you have to sign it. So license liability insurance requirements, the FAA launch license, which we talked about. If you look at liability under Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, and of course there's crew waiver claims, any claims against U.S. government, and the key word there is crew. And of course there's insurance and payment excess third party. You're looking at probable financial loss. I think right now it's about 500 million for a third party. And again, spaceflight participants or tourists, they're going to sign the informed consent. They're waiving their right. But here's the thing, though: the families of the spaceflight participants, they're not required to sign anything. So I guess the legal question would be, if there was a catastrophic accident, even with the informed consent waiver, I mean, can the family get damages? And as of right now, and luckily, that's not been tested. And important to note here, again, under the liability convention of the Outer Space Treaty, compensation for injury to U.S. citizens and damage to property in the United States caused by a spacecraft launch from the U.S. would be entirely a matter of U.S. law and not subject to the Outer Space Treaty. So real quick and then be done. This is the commercial astronaut qualifications, pretty interesting. You have to have a pilot license. It doesn't say commercial pilot license, it can be a private pilot license. You have to have an instrument rating. And in some cases, you have to actually have a airman medical certificate. Generally, if you're in a crew that you have a function of a safety critical role, you're going to have a second class medical certificate. Okay, so that's some of the things there. It must be a certified FAA launch, licensed launch. You got to meet the crew requirements per the Title 14 and 460. You got to go at least 50 miles and come back. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm going to hold all the questions to the end. And thank you, Professor Dr. Watts. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And we are doing great on time. Okay, so next up is going to be James Barney. He's a professor of legal studies in the School of Security and Global Studies. In addition to a JD, James has several master's degrees, including one in foreign policy. He's currently working on his PhD in history. He is the APUS pre-law advisor, and he is also a faculty advisor for the Phi Alpha Delta Law Fraternity and the Model UN Club. So he is going to kind of tie all this together and how it relates to our curriculum. He's talking about futurism, legal topics in the 21st century. So I will hand it over to you, James. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, for the introduction, and also thanks to Teresa and Gary and Mark for their presentations. And also I want to thank the organizers who invited me to speak here. This conference has been several years in the making, and I was tasked a couple of years ago to think about how we would teach space law. And that started a period of self-study and self-thought about how we would go about teaching space law. And in the interim 3 years, my thoughts have really radically changed about teaching space, and has gotten from a narrow perspective about teaching space law to envisioning teaching space as a much broader and wider field, which is, I don't want to go into the weeds here, and I always have to give disclaimers. These are my own thoughts and not any of the school, but how I want to leave 4 thoughts is, if I was to create a program to teach space, I would have these 4 pillar stones that, as you can see from the other speakers and the speakers during the day, space is really an interdisciplinary field. It has as its core the STEM subjects, and also a whole collection of other related subjects: law, policy, business, ethics, and it's all a very complicated mix of subject matter. So how do we teach that? And my argument is that rather than focusing on a content-based approach, we have to focus on a teaching students a problem-solving approach, which is, we can't really anticipate what the problems are going to be in 10, 20, 100 years, but we could teach students how to think about how to solve problems. And this kind of approach has been adopted by several schools recently. There's a brand new school out of London called the London Interdisciplinary University, which is focused, moving beyond subject matter and moving to an approach that focuses on problem solving and blurring the lines between subjects. Because, for example, complicated problems related to space involve solutions that are multidisciplinary, which are, go beyond legal issues, that they also deal with scientific issues. So that's one particular pillar. The other pillar is that if we're going to have students learning, and we don't know what's going to be in 10, 20, 30, 100 years, we have to get students to learn not just the content, but learn by doing things. And how they're doing things is inside the classroom, moving from an approach that focuses on students as recipients of knowledge to students as creating knowledge and solving problems. And you could do this within the classroom and outside the classroom using different experiential learning methods. For example, I'm involved in Model UN. That's one. But in the classroom, you can have case studies, the use of debates, get students thinking about solving problems rather than just regurgitating information or memorizing information. Because in the process of problem solving, you have to know content in order to try to formulate solutions. And then another pillar of this curriculum would always have to be to move beyond a perspective of an adversarial approach to education, which is the student, not only between the student and the professor, but between institutions. So space study in the future has to try to move beyond this approach and try to develop relationships between institutions, like for example, between universities, and not only between universities, but the lower level, K through 12, and also between universities and non-state actors and like business interests, and as well as to embrace the diverse nature of the field and also get as many voices in the mix as possible. And that goes to the fourth pillar, which any kind of program in the future would have to have, which is a focus on diversity inclusiveness. As a field of space, we don't want to recreate some of the inequalities that are in the current educational system, which are, as we know, certain people are excluded from STEM professions through a whole host of reasons. And in order to prevent the space field, which is heavily a STEM-based subject matter, there has to be an investment by educational institutions and private entities and government to try to resolve some of these inequalities so that you don't have gender or racial inequalities, as well as potential inequalities between countries. For example, the space as a field is very heavily focused on the developed world, the great powers. And we have to try to move beyond to make sure that space is just not another forum for the great power conflict. So we have to make sure that space and the exploration and exploitation of space resources are just not given to the benefit of wealthy nations or business interests. How do we create as educational institutions that we don't just merely become a tool of existing inequalities within the structure, so that we have to make sure that we're cognizant of these kind of thoughts. And this is raised by Gary, who raises some good points about the commercialization of space and the benefits of that, but there are also pitfalls. For example, there's a lot of talk about it's $1 trillion industry potentially in 2030, but how do we make sure that these benefits are not concentrated in the hands of a few rather than the benefits the most amount of people in the United States and in the world? We have to have a more global perspective. So as a professional educator, I kind of think those are the main thoughts as to how we would think about teaching, space. And we have to move beyond content, because from my experience, and it's over travel for the last 3 years at several conferences, and we focus on history, historical aspects of space and the business aspects. But we have to think when we're educating students, what is the world that they're going to live in 20, 40, or 50 years? And what are the type of, and at this time, we don't know. But what we can teach them is to try to think and try to solve problems. And that's what I think as we're crafting courses and curriculum, that these are the type of big pictures, issues that we have to keep in mind. So that's my thoughts, and I'm just glad to be here. And thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks. Yeah, that's terrific. So now we have time for questions and answers. We did have a couple of questions come in on the app earlier, so thought we would start with those. If people have additional questions, please, feel free to type them in to the chat or the Q&A section. So one of the questions that came in was advice on pursuing careers related to space law. And I know Therese provided some resources. Is there anything that any of you would like to add about that?
Sure, I'll go first. So hopefully that document that I send is pretty comprehensive. I would try to get involved in as many of the different organizations that are on there as you can. Space Generation Advisory Council is great if you're a young professional, as is the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, SEDS. They even have some international chapters as well. But really taking advantage of the conferences that are on that list, whether they're virtual or in person. A lot of organizations offer funding, and those are actually marked in the Google Doc to help students get there, or if you ask nicely, they may provide your registration for free or in exchange for volunteer time. I found the industry to be very friendly, and people will help you out if they meet you. They are generally very excited to talk to students. People are in this industry because they love it, not for the money, for the most part. So going to conferences, just talking to people, asking them if you can do an informational interview with them, half hour of their time to sit down and talk to you about their career trajectory. I always tell students, don't ask for a job in the informational interview. They will tell you if there's a position open at their company, and if they have a way to refer you, or they might have friends at other companies who might be interested in you. But really, for me, I switched from astronomy into the space industry, and I kind of knew no one when I switched over. And I moved to DC partway through my grad career, didn't know anyone, but I just started showing up to all the events, and then people magically knew me. And it got to the point where I was approaching graduation and people were just like, let me know when you're graduating, we probably have a job open for you. And I had never even worked directly with them. I just, had run into them at so many events, and they were more than willing to help. So that's my short version of advice. And please email me if you want more.
That's really good advice, but I was wondering if you also might want to comment on internships, since you're involved in an organization that promotes that, like who might be eligible, or if that's something that you might be able to ask people, hey, do you need an intern?
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. So I am one of the co-founders of the Z Factor Fellowship, which is a fellowship program that places undergrads who are from historically marginalized groups at an aerospace internship. We do generally summer and fall ones. The application will be coming online next month with a due date in early January. There are a few other, and we take students from all disciplines. There are a few other fellowship programs. The Asakowitz Fellowship does include grad students, but it's focused on technical internships. The Brooke Owens Fellowship is for undergrad women. And then the Patty Gray Smith Fellowship is for Black and African American undergrads in their first and second year of school who are doing their first aerospace internship. So those are all really great programs. If you're in space law or want to be in space law, the Space Court Foundation is an organization that has worked with a lot of students on internships and has interns. There are a bunch of policy internship links in that as well, since there's a lot of legal policy overlap. Huge table of science policy internships that's linked in the Google Doc. Most space companies want interns, and it's certainly worth reaching out, and even if they don't have anything on their website, talking to people that whatever company you might want to work for, because they might even invent an internship for you. So I guess that's my internship 101.
That's excellent. Thank you. Anyone have anything to add to that? Mark, I was kind of wondering if your program might be a good pathway, the one you're involved in right now.
I think Tree's got to hit on the head of the nail there. I mean, internships are really good to get. Going to these conferences is a super idea. So I'm not really sure what we're doing with this, but definitely going to these conferences and getting well known, and then volunteer for an internship.
Okay, wonderful. And we had another question come in on the app earlier, and it said, with commercial organizations beginning to participate in spaceflight, do you think that the treaties in place should be updated to correctly account for these new organizations? Any thoughts on that?
I would address that basically. If you looked at Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, remember, we're talking states here, so the United States is obviously a state. The state party, and I'm saying to the treaty, they're responsible for any activity carried out by their government agency or their non-governmental entities. So obviously a commercial would fall under non-government entity. And in the case of a non-government entity, any activity in outer space, that state must require authorization to continually supervise the appropriate organization and what they're doing. So I don't really think you really need to, but maybe some of these treaties could be updated, but it does kind of spell out the state's either government or non-government. So I would say probably not.
And I'd like to add on what Mark said. One thing to keep in mind is COPUOS is a consensus-based organization, and you're never going to get, I want to say there are 100-ish member countries now that are part of COPUOS. You are never going to get consensus on another treaty through COPUOS. So you've got to be realistic in this. It took them like a decade to come up with 21 long-term sustainability guidelines. And those were just guidelines. They weren't anything binding. But I think there's going to be a lot of bilateral and multilateral efforts that come up. So for instance, the Office of Space Commerce in the last administration was pretty active in coming up with bilateral treaties on things like space situational awareness data sharing. And also the State Department had a number of countries sign the Artemis Accords, which talks about cooperation on the moon. And I think there are going to be a lot more of those bilateral, multilateral efforts that may be US led, but are not, UN level treaties.
I just want to chime in to similar commentary that under the law, as Mark said, that these non-state actors, the commercial, are considered, their actions go back to the government. So kind of a lot of the discourse in the public, the public sphere is kind of based on misunderstanding about the treaties. And that's why I go back when I have a question for Gary, is that, a lot of these actions that are by the commercial, Bezos and Virgin, these ultimately, if anything went back wrong with any of these, they would go back to the U.S. government. So they're kind of viewed as proxies under the law. I think that's not something that's fully understood in the public. So it's kind of like the United States is endorsing what any of these non-state actors are doing. So there is a legal framework already, and they're operating these non-state actors within the existing legal framework that would, if there's something that went wrong, would go back to the government of launch or government of, origin. You have to look at the treaty, but I think there's sufficient legal precedent already.
I think that speaks to the international context, and James is right. But I think that, frankly, from a point of practicality, there are questions that we just haven't answered yet that will require some thought and reflection. For example, the Outer Space Treaty essentially stipulates that space and all of its contents, including the celestial bodies, belong to everybody, the people of Earth, including all of the states there too. But what happens when SpaceX wants to build a hotel on the moon in the same place that Hilton does, or Howard Johnson, right? Who has the rights to that acre of property? And I want the one that's beachfront because, the other one's less desirable. And I'm being, tongue in cheek, of course, here, but we may reach a point. I think it's probable to say in our lifetimes that we'll see at least the first boots on the ground in, at least back to the moon, and if not onto Mars and Venus, if the resolve of people like Musk is any indication. So we may not run into the point where we're now fighting over the most desirable plats of land in our lifetimes. But eventually, if colonization, industrialization, and development of these places, happens as we would hope it would, we're going to have to wrestle with those questions, because we both can't put a hotel in the same spot, right? So we've got to kind of figure out how we would share and divide in the same way that we would here, and in any civilized society. But the treaties that have been established, and with no intended sort of poke at them because they're a product of their times, they don't really address that because we just haven't gotten there yet. But I think we will sooner rather than later, and then we'll have to answer those questions one way or the other.
And Gary, this issue came up in several conferences I attended, and like Therese said, it's a potential problematic to re-engage, at least at this point in time, because it would open up fissions between Russia and China. They would say, whatever new system that would be developed would benefit, of course, the United States and these, which is, the Western world, which has these non-state actors. So for the temporary, at this point, maybe it's best to just hold off until we do colonize Mars. I remain skeptical about whether or not we're actually going to do a lot of what is said in the near term. Probably the major field is dealing with satellites and potential in the future, some kind of exploitation of the moon, maybe. I don't know how far that out is, maybe within our lifetime. So.
Kind of along that vein, I was really interested to hear a little bit more about the colonization of Mars versus Venus, Gary, that you had mentioned, because that sounds pretty fascinating. But also, if you see any educational tie-ins, are we going to do an internship on Mars eventually?
I think it could happen. I'm more of an optimist. I mean, I'm a realist for sure. I think there are a lot of problems to ultimately getting there. And the sort of bureaucratic legal problems are the least of our worries for the moment. We need to resolve the physical and technical challenges of making it happen. But yeah, the talk on Mars versus Venus was very interesting. Again, I did it at Houston at the Mensa conference. That's a world gathering they have once every few years, and a lot of interest in the topic. Essentially, what I was there to talk about was the idea that a lot of the attention in the pop culture, even sci-fi, and just sort of the general ethos of this topic seems to be on Mars. It seems that that's the obvious choice, right? I mean, why would it not be? But when you really look at it in a scrutinizing way, there's a case to be made for Venus, not on the surface, because, as any space enthusiast would know, it's about 900 degrees and the pressure is way too high. And so unless you're a pizza, you really don't want to be on the surface on Venus. But there have been propositions for technologized colonies that would actually float in the atmosphere within the layers of the Venusian atmosphere in places where, as it turns out, and I have the backing of some planetary scientists that have kind of vetted this data, there's a region around Venus, and it's at about 50 kilometers in altitude, where it turns out that the temperature and the pressure are such that we could survive without any type of external apparatus. We wouldn't need a spacesuit or a vehicle or a ship. I mean, we would need to be standing on something, obviously. So there have been propositions for things like dirigibles, like a blimp, that could float around. And yeah, there's other complications like sulfuric acid rain, but at that altitude, it's unclear how concentrated that is. And there's some evidence to suggest that it's low enough that it wouldn't even affect us. So, there's this prospect that's exciting to me when you think about the idea that there's a non-zero chance that there's a technological model that would allow you to go outside in your bathing suit in the rarefied atmosphere of Venus and kind of hang out, if only for a few minutes. And I think given the psychological implications of space exploration and how much we're willing to spend time with our neighbors and without losing our minds, I think that kind of thing is worth considering. So, Mars certainly has a lot of pros, and I discussed those in the talk, but the other side of it, of course, is that, Venus is closer. In some ways, it's easier. It's got more gravity, so we don't have to worry about the effects of deteriorated bone loss and atrophy in the same way that we would on Mars. But it's not at all to say that it's easy. And there have been mission profiles proposed. For example, the NASA HAVOC mission, HAVOC, High Altitude Venus Operational Concept. This was something that was put forth years ago, decades ago, and some would argue that it was shelved because it was too simplistic in origin, kind of like the Mars 1 mission. Basically, we would just bring an inflatable balloon there and then blow it up and float around at this altitude. It obviously has not come to fruition yet, but it's something that we could do. It's within the realm of our technological ability today. So I have hope. And honestly, if the funding and the interest would allow for it, I'd like to do both. So I'm not really partial to one versus the other, but it was interesting to see the contrast and the idea that not so many people think Venus is even viable in any way, shape, or form. And it turns out that in some ways, it's actually more so. It's just that we wouldn't be able to literally touch dig our feet into the sand, if you will. We'd never be able to go down to the surface. There's virtually zero chance of that happening. But 50 kilometers up is a nice place relative to even Mars. So something to think about.
Well, Gary, I just want to chime in because one of the things I think that permeates the discussion of space is an element of sci-fi and escapism, just try to escape the Earth. But I think if the field is really to have a future, it has to make sure that the space exploration and whatever exploitation of resources benefit the most amount of people out there. So there's a significant amount of buy-in from the broader public in the Earth. We have to view space as how it can benefit the exploration or exploitation the most amount of people. And unless they have they come up with some kind of reason as to why we go to Mars or Venus, that it would help, in the short term. Like, for example, there's Musk is sending up thousands of satellites, and he's developing a Wi-Fi system that's going to link up people who are, don't have internet connection. Now, why isn't that technology being used to provide people in Africa, Latin America, and Asia with necessary Wi-Fi capabilities? Why should it just benefit a particular, billionaire? And that would maybe give more buy-in to the world if the benefits of space are spread out to the most amount of people, that this would justify doing further exploration, and to say, oh, these are tangible benefits that we're getting from the space endeavors, rather than just benefiting, a small group of countries or a small group of people. So that's how I kind of think the way forward is developing ideas to try to get the benefits to the most amount of people, and show people that there are real tangible benefits to GPS, internet access, science and technology developments that would benefit people. And then there's a side issue with the, it's fun to go up to Venus or Mars, but I kind of think from attending a lot of conferences, we get sidetracked with a lot of these, fun Star Trek versus Star Wars debates, or, where we're going to go first. But how does this really affect somebody living in America who's having a hard time? How does this help them? And we got to try to make the case stronger that it does help them, because there are potential benefits. So that's my take. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think that should be a focus, and I'm familiar with the Starlink mission agenda. I've actually written about it several times, and as far as I know, it is Musk's ultimate plan to be able to offer that program to as many people as are able to use it worldwide, because it would cast a net that would be truly global. But as you know, there are also issues of sovereignty that need to be considered. The satellites would need to be effectively turned off over places like China, so that they're not shot down in pursuit of maintaining the Great Firewall, as we've come to call it. So, but I certainly agree that the benefits need to be considered. And from my point of view, which was at the beginning, the preface, the strong preface for my presentation at Mensa was that, this is the existential lifeboat. This is the humanity alternate place to keep some of our eggs, so that in the event of a catastrophe, which could be at our doing, nuclear destruction, could be natural, super volcanic, could be cosmic, another big rock comes and slams into us. We really don't know, and we don't have our handle on all that. But with everybody here, quite literally here, then this entire human project could be in vain if something like that were to happen tomorrow, and we don't have anywhere else from which we could begin to rebuild. So, again, I'm not necessarily partial to Venus or Mars, as long as we have somewhere from which we'd be able to restart, and someone there to kind of serve that role of survivorship in the event that something terrible happens on planet Earth.
Well, definitely. That's why I said that there's a lot of escapism, because it's premised on the idea there has to be somewhere to go. I'm of the opinion that we're going nowhere, but we have to make this world better, and the best we can try to do. And hopefully, because in the near term, even we're talking about colonization, as you said, that would not be everyone. That would be only a handful. And I'm trying to look for the maximum amount of benefit for the people who are living here, not a handful of people who may escape and live around Venus or Mars, but these are the kind of debates that go on at space conferences. And I'm just glad to be here.
What? I'm really glad that you mentioned satellites and internet access. That was something, I was looking into, as far as in the United States, just in a lot of indigenous areas, a lot of people in the United States don't have, solid internet access, which has important implications for education, especially now when so many of us are online. Did you all see that as a viable, affordable? Has it been successful so far in the satellites that have launched in providing people reliable access? And I know we're almost out of time. But.
Yeah, I can speak to what I know thus far, what's been publicly released, and that is to say that it's in limited beta at this point. There are a few hundred in orbit, and that allows for certain hemispheres at certain times of the day to receive coverage. The ultimate goal, per the FAA approvals, is to have a constellation of more than 12,000, which would provide constant coverage. And obviously that takes a bunch of launches, because they're capable of launching about 60 laid flat in a payload bay of a Falcon 9 rocket. The advantage by using very low Earth orbit with the Starlink profile, which I like, is low latency. Because of the low altitude, you don't have so much delay between receivership and transmitter and back. And that's really necessary to be able to compete with terrestrial broadband. Otherwise, you don't have the latency advantage. The problem with that is atmospheric decay. So over time, because you're flying so low, these satellites are just slowing down and they're dropping in orbit, and eventually they'll burn up. Not necessarily a continuing problem for Musk, or one that would bankrupt his company, because he also happens to own the rocket company that supports his logistics for it. So I think he's planning for these to be disposable over a time frame of years. But until we reach that full constellation, it is in limited beta. It's worth mentioning today, and again, I don't hold stock. I'm not even a Starlink customer yet, but it is available for people who want to be part of the beta test. You can go to their website. I'm sure it's probably starlink.com or something to that effect, and sign up. It costs, I think, about $500 for the hardware, which is like a big pizza-sized satellite dish that goes on your house. And then it would, in theory, provide broadband to you during the windows that you're available to receive it from the satellites flying overhead. But it's clearly stated, at least the last time I visited their website, that it's in its limited infancy right now. So don't expect it to be comparable to like your cable broadband network that you could get at home. But it is available right now for people who want to try it in certain markets, geographically speaking.
I'd like to add that there are Geo Satellites that have also provided satellite internet service for decades. In addition to a number of non-geostationary providers. So SES-03B is in MEO. OneWeb has launched a number of satellites. It should be starting to provide service soon. Amazon's working on its own constellation. Telesat's working on one too. So there should be a lot of internet access. And I know tribal nations in particular are very excited about the potential for internet access. And Starlink has already worked with First Nations tribes in Nunavut to provide internet service in Canada in the Arctic, since Geo Satellites have problems with Arctic coverage due to their position. But it still, remains to be seen what the affordable pricing models are. And in terms of government subsidies, they have often not been technology neutral and have favored fiber. So in terms of government assistance in rolling out internet access, we'll see if space is included in that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. And that's a great point, Therese, but that's the real prospect that could ultimately change a lot about the way we live as human beings on planet Earth. Because as you pointed out, there have been satellite internet and data and phone telecom companies for decades now. The problem is, if you wanted to make a call from one of these companies from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, say 5 years ago, the cost to make that call would be like mortgage your house. It's been obscenely expensive. Now, Musk is aiming for $99 a month with the Starlink program. I don't know enough about their costs and overhead to be able to speak to, what Therese was just speaking to in terms of, can they keep that price point? Can they? Because if they could, that would in theory be viably competitive with your local broadband carrier. I mean, I pay more than $99 a month to Spectrum, here at my house. So if it is, then great. But if not, if it ends up being, $500 or $1,000 a month just to cover their cost, then obviously that's a whole different story. So yet to be seen.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we are about out of time, or perhaps a little over, but that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for speaking today.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience and those who submitted questions ahead of time. Those were wonderful questions. Great start to the discussion. So
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.